Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Reagan and Gorbachev together again, this time in Moscow, to discuss missile testing, to discuss additional arms limitations, to discuss strategic defense initiative, to discuss whatever they want to put on their agenda. What are the prospects for real progress, and how are we going to overcome the same stumbling blocks, human rights, freedoms, Afghanistan? Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll discuss the summit ongoing with our panelists Tom Sargent from Ball State's Political Science Department, Ruth Howes from the Department of Physics at Ball State, and John Barber from the History Department. Tom, a little background, a little introduction. I said together again, Reagan and Gorbachev has set some groundwork here. What really is, if there is, an agenda for this meeting? What sort of expectations have we put on this meeting?
Well, the expectations that have been put on it by the Americans have been pretty low. In the run-up to this meeting last week, last 2 or 3 weeks, there's been very little positive expectation out of Washington that much was going to happen because clearly the START talks hadn't gotten very far, or hadn't gotten far enough anyway, for any kind of definitive signatures on the treaty. So there hadn't been much expectations. I think the major element of this summit is probably 2 or 3-fold. One is that it's the atmospherics are terrific. Everybody seems to be having a wonderful time in Moscow, and that's fine. They'd like to reciprocate our hospitality last December, I suppose. Secondly, it's interesting and fascinating to me that this is the 4th summit of these men, and the most that any president has had. Now, if you think back 8 years, 7 years, to the early days of the Reagan administration, would you have thought that Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, with all that implies, would have been the president in the latter years of the 20th century that would meet the most times with his Soviet counterpart? I would have thought not. And that's one of the fascinating things about this thing and one of the interesting background elements to it. There's been a real evolution of thinking and ideas on both sides with regard to the summitry.
John, I think that's a good question. Is Ronald Reagan, you would not have expected a Ronald Reagan who was campaigning for president in 76 or in 80 to be the kind sitting down with the leader of the Soviet Union. Have things changed with Ronald Reagan?
I really think so. It's been a shock to me for Ronald Reagan to say the things that he has said in the last couple of years, the way they contrast with what he said at first. I think this is a drastic change in Ronald Reagan's thinking, but he won't say so. This morning, he was holding a news conference in the Soviet Union, and reporters asked him twice why the change in what he was saying about the Soviet Union. And both times he said, General Secretary Gorbachev has brought many changes. And someone came back and said, yes, but they were pressing him on this. Haven't you changed in your attitude toward the Soviet Union? And he said, Gorbachev has changed the Soviet Union a lot. So he refused to say that his attitude had changed. Then a young woman who raised questions about students, college students especially, and his interaction with them at the University of Moscow, said, but when you have this kind of interaction with Soviet people, the young people and others, doesn't this change the way people feel about each other? And isn't this one of the important things about cultural contacts? It changes the way people like you feel about the Soviet Union. And he still would not say that he had changed. In spite of that, I think that Reagan's attitude has changed drastically. And I think that the personal interaction with Gorbachev has had a lot to do with it. I really do.
Is Ronald Reagan writing his chapter in history, his best chapter?
I think he may be. I think he may be writing his best chapter in the same sense that Nixon did. No matter how much people say negative things about Nixon for Watergate, they still will usually praise him for his foreign policy and say that no one else could have done as much to ease tensions between the Soviets and the Americans as Nixon did. I think Ronald Reagan is doing the same kind of thing. And he may have something domestic that people will point back to and say that's really great, but I really suspect that this is what's going to be considered most in the future, at least the near future, when people talk about his achievements, change in relationships with the Soviets.
The arms limitations talks continue, Ruth. There have been some progress to this date, perhaps not in this summit, but to this date anyway. Is this not also an historic moment for Ronald Reagan, for America, to be able to sit down with the Soviet Union and to come to some agreement? And do we expect something out of this summit further along those lines?
I hate to sound pessimistic, but I think the START talks are thoroughly bogged down in three major issues. First of all, the Soviets want, I think, major reductions in offensive forces. They are not going to do so without some limitation on SDI, without some firm commitment on our part not to deploy defenses for some fixed period of time. Secondly, both sides are worried about sea-launched cruise missiles, which are tiny air-breathing, nuclear-armed missiles that could fit easily in this studio. They're very hard to verify. They can carry conventional as well as nuclear warheads, and you can't tell the difference. So we're bogged there. The third big issue that nobody really wants to talk about is on-site inspection. People have been very happy over the fact that the Soviets are going to monitor our missiles in Magna, Utah, and we're going to monitor theirs in Vatkinsk. What people haven't really thought about is the implications of on-site inspection for a START treaty, because that means we're going to have a heavy Soviet presence monitoring industry in the United States, and our Constitution forbids this kind of thing. So I don't think on-site inspection is the panacea we've held it out to be in the INF Treaty. And so I think we have these three tough issues: the sea-launched cruise missiles, SDI, and the issue of on-site inspection that we're going to have to face before we make progress. So I'm really glad we're talking, but...
Could I raise a question?
Please.
Larry, I'm just curious about two things. One is the SDI. I had thought the information that one gets, in some sources anyway, is that in effect there had been a sort of agreement to disagree on that for the time being, and that with regard to the START talks, that this had been set aside for a period of time until maybe even later on, after the treaty's been signed. Clearly you think differently, and sort of why do you think differently? What's the source on that, or what's the information you have?
Well, according to my information, normal newspaper, what I read, the discussion in this country is about immediate deployment. We have tests planned for next year that are going to pretty clearly violate the narrow interpretation of the ABM Treaty, the conventional interpretation of the ABM Treaty. And therefore, we have to make a decision on whether or not the ABM Treaty is going to hold in its traditional form, whether we mean the broad interpretation of it, just what's going on. And this is immediate. We must do so within the next few months. And I think that SDI is still with us.
Well, one thought was at one point along the line that Gorbachev had agreed to sort of set that aside because either Congress would reduce the funding or else President Reagan would go out of office. One of those, or both those events were going to happen. And that I thought maybe that was one element in the decision to simply agree to disagree on that matter.
Well, you can agree to disagree, but you can't...
Forever.
Forever.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point you
enough.
have to work out your differences.
Yeah. What was the Constitution thing? Why can't we...
I don't understand that. What about the Constitution says this can't happen?
The on-site inspection? Simply that in order to search private property in this country, you have to have warrants and so on. I'm no lawyer, so forgive me on this one. And if the Soviet inspectors, if the United States government can't inspect my garage, can the Soviet Union?
Well, you know, I think
this issue's come to the fore in chemical inspection. Some of the Western European allies have fought very hard against having chemical plants inspected, for example. They're worried about industrial espionage.
But that makes it sound like the Constitution says the Soviets can't come and do that, and it doesn't necessarily. You know, if the government says, okay, the Soviets can inspect or we take your contract away, then, you know, the corporation can say, okay, take the contract or inspect, you know.
Sure.
So that won't violate the Constitution.
If they have on-site, it's going to have to be be very carefully written.
Sure.
I mean, it's not a panacea.
That's why we're being bogged down. One of the reasons we're being
right,
bogged down.
and that's what I mean when I say...
it's a constitutional issue, whether it's,
Which is an interesting irony because, you know, we've been saying for 30 years that the Soviets would not let us have on-site inspection, and until they would, we wouldn't sign any arms control treaties with them. Well, what most Americans didn't know was that for 30 years the Soviets have been saying, let's talk about on-site inspection. Maybe we can do this. They proposed it in 1955. And now, 1985 to 88, both sides finally get around to recognizing that both sides are saying, let's have on-site inspection. And then when we start trying to implement the idea, the United States seems to have more hesitation about it than the Soviets.
Well, it's
which is really
ironic that
strange.
as a free society that issue would come up. But again, as Ruth says, you're talking about personal property rights as
That's
well.
right.
Search
And it
and
is a
seizure and
problem.
Well,
Fourth
there's one
Amendment.
other element too in that, and that is that clearly we aren't anxious to have every industrial secret we have distributed to the Soviet Union or anyplace else
That's
as far
right.
as that goes, and that may be one element in the hesitation, John, about
The
this.
Soviets used to want to hide all their railroad junctions and all their bridges. They thought all of that was strategic, and they're still a little bit that way, and that's why they didn't want on-site inspection. And now we're the same way, just about much more complicated things. And nations are right to be concerned about those kinds of inspections, and it is a problem. I'm not sure, though, that it's going to forever stand in the way of some kind of arms reduction agreement. I don't think SDI will either.
No, but I would like to say that I don't think on-site inspection is a panacea. I think that much of the conventional arms control community has said, well, if we just have enough on-site inspection, everything will be hunky-dory and life will be beautiful. And I think that we need to rethink our positions. It's costing a fantastic amount of money to monitor Vatkinsk. And that's a small operation, but the budgets are unbelievable. You have to consider things like the budget the FBI is asked to watch the Soviet inspectors in Magna, Utah, things like this. So I think that we need to take a deep breath and think a little bit about national technical means again.
Oh, sure. I think eventually that's what we'll get around to, which, satellite surveillance and that kind of thing. If both sides can agree on opening silos and uncovering the shrouds on the missiles, and you can count nose cones on land-based missiles from outer space, from 100 miles up, very accurately. And I suspect we could find a way to do that to some extent with sea-based missiles, although it's a bigger problem since, cruise missile is 20 feet long or whatever with a wingspan of about 5 feet. You do have a bigger problem. So the further we go with that technology, the harder it's going to be by national technical means, as they put it, to have real verification.
That monitoring involves more than just being there on the site, like say counting nose
On-site
counts.
inspection may not be as good as satellite surveillance.
What do I raise one other question with Ruth?
You're doing fine, Tom.
Well, the reason I do that is because politically there's been, it seems to me, some progress on this summit, and that progress seems to me to have expressed itself in the idea, yes, we're going to try by the end of the president's term, which would be January of '89, to have some kind of START treaty. Now, you just raised, and I'm sure rightly so, these issues regarding problems with that treaty. What do you think about the next 6 months? Do you think something can happen in 6 months? Clearly something can happen. Is it going to happen in 6 months, in your view?
I think it depends on whether President Reagan comes down to earth on, excuse the pun, on SDI. I didn't mean that. He's going to have to make some compromises. He's going to have to agree, I think, minimally to the narrow interpretation of the ABM treaty, or to some very carefully worked out agreement on what tests are going to be allowed. If he is willing to do this, I think they can ignore the sea-launched cruise missiles issue and just agree to disagree, as you say, and work it out. But I think without some compromise.
They have, in fact, said in news releases since the summit started that they have been discussing the possibility of ignoring those really difficult areas and going ahead with agreement in the areas where they can agree. And then SDI might become the barrier to agreement, say, on land-based missiles. But Reagan has already proved that he can change pretty drastically in his position with respect to the Soviet Union. He could do it on SDI, and I wouldn't say that's at all impossible.
I'm sorry, but I find it comic that we're offering to share SDI technology with the whole world. I can just imagine sharing with Gaddafi.
Well, I'm not sure that's moved a bit, surely, that sharing.
He said this morning that's what he meant.
And the president, the president clearly has changed his mind on a lot of things. I don't think there's any question about that. However, he has hung on so stubbornly, so publicly, so long on this SDI matter that I would be, for one, and I don't have a strong ideological position on this, but I'd be stunned if he would change his mind on SDI and agree to give up that idea.
I would too, but I've already been stunned, so I expect to be stunned again.
That's still his one big bargaining chip, or at least he perceives it as that. Is that not true?
I'm not sure.
He may not perceive it as a bargaining chip.
Yes,
he may perceive it as an irrevocable stand on which he's... I don't know. I'm just putting it...
I think he may think that it is a technological fix to the problem of nuclear weapons. I really think he may think this.
Well, there's a strong view that that any president or chief of state of a country which possesses nuclear weapons has a moral right, moral duty to try and promote some kind of defense mechanism or some kind of system which would prevent the use of those weapons. And SDI is one such proposal. I'm not suggesting necessarily it's going to work tomorrow, but I am suggesting
Not many
one
people
such
think
proposal.
it'll work to that extent.
But that's one possibility.
You'd mentioned the atmospherics, the attitudes of people involved. They obviously a really upbeat kind of thing, but approach going into it. But the president has said he's encouraged by the reforms he sees in the Soviet Union. Still, there are some real stumbling blocks, and the president identified those early, I assume so as not to make conservatives think that he's capitulating totally to the Soviets, but in fact he said we still have some real problems over the Soviet approach to human rights, over the Soviet approach to personal freedoms. Are those not going to be stumbling blocks? Are those merely givens that we're going to continue to agree to disagree and that we will go on from there?
Well, I think there are going to be stumbling blocks in some areas, in some parts of the United States. A couple observations are one that I was struck in listening to some of his comments, including some this morning and then some yesterday. The old maxim that sovereign states, in this case represented by the president, can behave in ways in which an individual would never dream of behaving. Can you imagine going to somebody's house, criticizing the way they conduct their affairs and all that sort of thing? And that's in fact what he did in Moscow. But the second observation is that he clearly, in my judgment, did that because he was playing to a domestic audience in the United States, and may also have been attempting to play to some audience in the Soviet Union. I'm not sure which one. Maybe groups of dissidents, maybe groups of students who he thought might be more liberal and want to encourage the current, what he sees as the current trends. However, the third point I would make is that he's changed in a lot of ways, and it's easy to switch views in that area. You can always say, yes, progress is being made in human rights in the Soviet Union. Yes, immigration is proceeding in the Soviet Union. Slowly, not as much as we want, but it's proceeding. And I think those things are not stumbling blocks per se. I think they may be elements in which he plays the domestic political role, maybe in both countries.
That's what leaders of nations do. They say, well, here's a problem and it prevents our getting together. And then they just declare it no longer exists. Mm-hmm. You say we can't get out of Vietnam, and then you say, well, we can get out of Vietnam. We can't get out of Afghanistan. Well, we can now get out of Afghanistan. National leaders do that. And I think President Reagan can say they're making so much progress on human rights that no longer stands as a barrier between our agreements in other areas. And I think he paved the way for that this morning. He's been saying for a couple of days now that the main reason why so many Soviets are, for example, denied the right to leave their country when they want to is bureaucratic red tape. And he kept insisting that that's the main problem, rather than being something evil in the heart of the Soviet Union. That's a new approach to saying where the problem of human rights lies in the Soviet Union. And I think he's, consciously or not, I think rather unconsciously, he's laying groundwork for what's going to be a different image from Ronald Reagan about the Soviet Union and human rights. He's going to keep saying they're wrong in a lot of ways, but they have moved light years ahead of where they were. And I think in truth, they have moved. I've never seen a society change that rapidly on an issue like human rights and political activities as the Soviet Union has in the last 3 years. It is a revolution, I really think.
Then Ronald Reagan is perhaps right then in saying that I haven't changed. Soviets have changed.
Well, in a sense, yes, because their change has been much more drastic than his. That's true, really.
I find it very hard, this is not my area, so let me ask you, to separate out how much is a real substantive change in the way the Soviets do business, and how much is just a difference in the media coverage that we get on it.
The window dressing. Hey,
Yes.
How much of it is for show and how much of it is...
How much is perception, how much is reality? Is that
Yes, yes, exactly.
Well, I mean, who knows? And it's not going to be reality overnight. It may be perception overnight, but it won't be reality overnight. Right. There'll be a long period of development and change. And I think John's absolutely right. We've been seeing some of that over the last what, 2 or 3 years since
Glasnost and perestroika preceded Gorbachev. Some people are saying that it was a real wave in the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev caught it and is riding with it, and he is a tremendously effective spokesman for that process of opening up the Soviet Union much more than it used to be. And I think it is really a broad wave of changes taking place there. And there are little signs of how drastic these changes are. Gorbachev today had the first ever, quote, Western-style press conference in the Soviet Union, where he faced for a couple of hours an international press corps. I mean, can you imagine Joseph Stalin doing that? For God's sake, no. It just doesn't happen. I mean, this is drastic change. Yeltsin, quote, liberal in the Central Committee and on the Politburo, who got pushed aside because he was being too much for perestroika and glasnost and too critical of the Soviet right wing. He was pushed aside for a while. He comes on and is interviewed by 2 American network TV programs, and he says on there that Ligachev, who is considered to be the conservative, kind of a little bit Stalinist character in the Politburo, he says this guy ought to be thrown off the Politburo. And he says this on international television. Now, that just could not have happened a few years ago. That's a drastic change. It really is. The press, the Western press, broadcasts directly from Moscow by satellite. No filtering through the Soviet communication system. No censorship at all. This is the first time in history that has ever happened from the Soviet Union. These are really significant changes.
So you're arguing this is just not window dressing?
No.
These are...
I don't, you know, if you take the whole body of Soviet society and say, well, how much it has changed, it's a small piece. But compared to how much usually changes, that's really drastic.
Is it Gorbachev sees the need to improve the public relations of the Soviet Union, or is it that the Soviet Union, for economic reasons, needs to become a much more involved partner in the free world?
I think that Gorbachev and people like him in the Soviet Union, who've always been there since the 20s and before, I think he has decided, and I think he's right, that the Soviet economy and the Soviet social structure and maybe the Soviet political structure, if it is going to thrive, has to make these kinds of changes. That doesn't mean it will collapse if they stay the way they were. But they are not going to thrive, do really well, unless they make these kinds of changes. They're going to have to be what we call more liberal in the sense of a freer people, or it's simply not going to work as well as they want it to.
There's an interesting argument, Larry, that I'd raise with you, and not that I support it, but I think it's an interesting one. It occurred to me as doing some reading about this the last day or two. Is it really in the United States' best interest that the Soviet Union does become a major economic power in the world? I mean, clearly it's important economic power, but I mean to become a real economic and political rival of the United States and of Western Europe and Japan, or is it really going to just provide us with another competitor, another major economic competitor in the world? My answer to that, and I'm asking the question as well I can answer, my answer to that is in a way, well, I think we have to live with that and hope for the best and go ahead and promote that kind of development. But it's a question which a lot of people are asking, in fact have asked in this country already. Maybe we should help keep them down rather than push them forward.
Don't we look at it not merely as a competing producer, but as a very real market for our, whether it be Big Macs and blue jeans or anything else we might be producing?
That's one answer, and one very specific answer to the question. Sure, let's sell them everything we can and take advantage of all that. This is the oil for the lamps of China thing, which was a concept for 100 years.
We could solve the Soviet citizenry's problem of having more rubles than they have consumer goods. If they want to spend the rubles on consumer goods, we can produce the consumer goods.
Well, then are we seeing the westernization of the Soviet Union? Is that what this is?
A lot. A lot.
Some.
Somewhere between some and a lot.
A great deal. The educated classes, the classes that are better off economically, the urban classes, these people are increasingly westernized. That's a process that's been going on for centuries. The rural classes, not so.
Well, is it desirable that, let me ask that question another way. Don't you think there are elements in the Soviet Union which are deeply concerned and disturbed over the idea that the country being westernized? Isn't this in fact an evil thing that's happening? I mean, Iran, we just went through this with Iran a few years ago. Is this something bad that may be happening in the Soviet Union and maybe a real problem, or should we again support all the idea of westernization and push it? And if the internal situation reaches extreme pressures, so be it. We should go ahead and help. Is that your view, John?
No, I don't want to, cause them problems necessarily. When they get troubled, we get troubled as an indirect result. There are people in the Soviet Union, from ordinary citizens out in the hinterlands to very prominent figures in the Central Committee and the Politburo, who don't like this increasing westernization of some parts of Soviet society. And as that process continues, there are going to be some tensions in the Soviet Union that will, I think, inevitably develop. And the real question is whether or not people like Gorbachev can cope with that and placate those people enough to keep things together and on an even enough keel that they can get along well. I don't think we should try to promote problems inside the Soviet Union in that respect any more than I want them promoting them over here for us. Because what often happens when nations, great powers like these, start having those kinds of internal divisions, they sometimes pull them together by getting hostile toward the other superpower. And as armed as we are to the teeth, I think that would be real dangerous for both sides. I really do.
Is the media, one last thing quickly, is the media fascination with the Raja Nancy thing here, is this of some symbolic significance, or is it just some frivolous sidelight that the media and perhaps the American public just likes to pander in?
No, I think it's some frivolous sidelight, if I may say so. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. I mean, a great deal of attention.
I don't attach any symbolism to this or anything like that. I mean, that's not.
I think it's part of the human interest story that is important. The Soviets need to see us from the First Lady down to the least gentleman, and we need to see them in the same way. We need to know more about what each other's life is like. And I think when Nancy Reagan visits the Hermitage and the Peterhof in Leningrad and comes away saying, I have seen the palaces of Imperial Russia, I can understand better how the Bolsheviks felt and why they wanted to overthrow that small, very rich class because so many people were suffering. When she reacts like that, that's not just window dressing. That's not just People magazine journalism. That's a significant kind of thing to be communicated over American and Soviet media. I really think so.
A secondary issue, perhaps, but it needs to be said.
I'm not even sure it's secondary. The most important thing happening in the summits may be that both sides are learning more about each other down at that level of sports and farming and the kitchen and so forth.
Thank you. We're out of time. Thanks to our panelists Ruth Howes, Tom Sargent, and John Barber for their participation today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Nancy Carlson, Steve Johnson, and Bill Mosher. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.